right, folks, welcome back. This is episode 4 of the Experimental and Civic Arts Lab podcast. In this episode, I want to talk about practice, the idea of practice. And specifically, I want to talk about music composition and other forms of creative expression as forms of contemplative practice. In his work and his writings, Martin Luther King essentially was fulfilling the role of a spiritual exemplar, or if you don't like the word spiritual, as a contemplative exemplar. He saw his work as a form of practice in fulfillment of his beliefs and his values and his social political commitments. So if we're going to translate his principles of activism into the creative realm as a rubric for the creative arts, then we ought to see the creative arts as a form of practice in a similar way that King saw his activism as a form of practice. You might say there's two levels of a contemplative practice. One is more inward looking, where there's some potential for development of skills, but also an expansion of one's understanding and perception. The other level is more outward looking, where the idea that the self is contained within one individual is called into question, and we embody the idea that the self is beyond the individual. We understand and develop the self through our encounter with others and our relationship with others. Both of these levels are important, and the idea is not that you are doing one and then the other, or that there's some magic ratio where you should be doing one 80% of the time and the other 20% of the time. It is a dynamic process. I would suggest you can think of the inward goal as more of a gravitational centripetal force that's keeping a sense of self together and allowing the self as it is to cope or to center itself within the current context. And you can think of the more outward or socially engaged aspect of a practice as being an outward pushing, sometimes destabilizing, but ultimately transformative force, or a centrifugal force. And actually, the balance between those two things, as centrifugal and centripetal force, is what keeps objects that we depend on in our media ecosystem, like satellites, in orbit and moving to our benefit, but also restrained by the Earth's gravity so they don't fly off into space. I'm suggesting that a work of creative expression that is contemplative in nature and that is in line with King's principles of nonviolent activism will have both of these dimensions in operation throughout the process. It will attend to the self in the way that allows the self to cope or to stabilize or to center in the current context. But it also pushes outward on the sense of self and allows for transformation in the sense that our understanding of self expands to include more others. I would say this kind of practice deliberately blurs the line between self and other. I develop aspects of my practice that are stabilizing and centering and that allow me to cope for my own benefit, but also so that I can serve others in their process of caring for the self. So I want to explore the tensions between practice as coping and stabilizing versus practice as transforming. If you can imagine that in an early stage of one's practice, the map that we have of our own experience and the world around us is relatively small, and The practices that we engage in every day or throughout the day are ones that allow us to navigate the known world in which we live. Those kinds of practices function sort of as rest stops that allow us to refuel and rejuvenate and refocus before we get back onto a similar path in a similar area. So a more or less daily routine. There are other practices, though, or other aspects of spiritual, contemplative, artistic practice that have a transformative element, which, if we commit to them over the long term, will trouble our more limited sense of self and open us and open our perception to knowledge of and experience of a broader understanding of the world and a more complex internal map of ourselves in the world. There are other elements of practice, whether it is a spiritual, contemplative, or artistic practice, which can open us up to wider experience, to novel ideas or insights, to perspectives that we had not been capable of holding previously. These aspects of practice are transformative, and while they don't necessarily undermine or destroy our previous map of the world, they certainly challenge our assumptions about the nature and limits of the world that we live in a similar way that a child at one stage of development has only an understanding of their household and their immediate neighborhood, possibly even the name of their town, and later has a much more complex, more expansive understanding of their world to include the local communities, the state level, and some notion of a national identity in relation to other national identities on the planet. When it comes to our knowledge of the world, we might call that education. When it comes to our moral relationship to the world, you might call that spiritual practice or contemplative practice. In musical composition, we have day-to-day practices where we strengthen our skills and we reinforce our knowledge so that we can continue to play what we've been playing, and so we can begin to play more complex versions of what we know. Also, so we can expand the palette of emotional colors or hues that we can work with in our pieces. That's all well and good if you want the creative work that you do to be transformative, not just for yourself personally, but for the social, political world that you live in, then part of your process has to not just challenge you in terms of your physical ability with your instruments, but also challenge you emotionally and in terms of your perspective, your ability to gain perspective, and your ability to speak in an authentic but authoritative voice about a wider range of experience, including an ability to empathize, to internalize a voice of someone or some group of people with whom you may disagree. This is why I think there are important parallels between Martin Luther King's activist practice and the kind of practices described by Sharon Salzberg, for example, in her book, Loving Kindness. Loving kindness meditation involves several stages, the first and easiest of which is to extend care and love and a wish for the end of suffering to oneself, and then to others whom one cares about already. and then to someone you may not know very well and may have neutral feelings about, and then to people who you either know very well or don't know very well, but about whom you have intense negative feelings. So I think in taking King's principles of nonviolent activism and applying it to the creative realm, especially when we're dealing with contentious social issues, it's important to engage on those multiple levels throughout the piece. We can attend as artists to our own self-care with regard to what's happening in the world, and we can attend to the experience of people we may or may not know, but about whom we have strong and negative feelings. I think when we're applying King's principles of nonviolent activism to creative work meant for a wider audience, we have to, from the beginning, question the separation between the self and others, especially the separation between the self and others whom we do not particularly care for or whose behavior we regard as negative or dangerous or wrongheaded. We question those assumptions about the self on the premise that the self that we know is by definition not the entirety of the story of the self. There are always aspects of the self that we don't know, but which we can come to know, come to experience, and come to understand. This requires us to hold our own emotions in a very particular regard. On one hand, in caring for the self as it is in this moment, we have to acknowledge and appreciate the value of even negative emotions like anger or animosity. But we do so, we acknowledge those emotions while holding in mind that those emotions are reflective of a version of the self which is not yet complete. In other words, you can't deny the anger that you have with regard to a social issue or with regard to a certain group of people, but you can deny that your limited perspective in the current moment is the full story. You know that implicitly on some level. One reason why the creative arts like music and dance are so effective at processing emotion and communicating emotion, and therefore in widening perspective, is that they access parts of our experience that are beyond language. In the stages of development or the stages of the self that I mentioned earlier, there is one constant, even as the roads keep expanding and even as the map keeps becoming more complicated. And that constant is the background against which these many roads and rest stops and transformative practices appear. Music and the creative arts allow us to expand our experience by giving us a means by which to navigate uncharted territory in human experience and perception.